While it seems like most of the deaths happen far away from us and far away from here, we would be wrong to think so. Right here in Chicago, a 37-year-old trans black woman was murdered by an 18-year-old male high school student. During the most violent 24-hour period in the past 60 years in Chicago, on May 31st, Selena Reyes Hernandez was shot and killed by Orlando Perez. They had gone in the early morning hours to Reyes Hernandez's apartment, where she revealed she was transgender. Perez left her home, returned a little bit later, shot and killed her, left again, and then went back an hour later, shooting her several more times despite the fact that she was already dead. When we congratulate ourselves for how far we've come in LGBTQIA rights and advocacy, and we have come a long way, we cannot congratulate ourselves when it comes to trans folks and when it comes particularly to Black trans women. Their average lifespan is 31 years of age because so many of them are murdered. Within a 2-week period of when Selena was killed, 3 other Black transgender women were killed. Actually, 1 was a man, 2 were women. Tony McDade is a Black transgender man who was killed on May 27th in Florida by a police officer. And on June 9th, 2 Black transgender women were killed. Rhea Milton was killed in Ohio, and Dominique Remy Fells was killed in Philadelphia. In the first 6 months of this year, close to 3 transgender people a month have been murdered. Often, they are misgendered in police and coroner reports. You might remember when our transgender member Michelle was found dead, and I was called to go identify the body, and I then had issues with the detectives in trying to get them to use her legal name rather than the name she was given at birth, and to refer to her chosen gender as opposed to her gender assigned at birth. I then had conversations with the coroner and ran into the same obstacles. When a detective refuses to use a legal name and uses the name at birth, that's called using that person's dead name. A dead name for a transgender person is the name they were given at birth. Many transgender folks change their names legally to go with their gender identities, though some are unable to do so for a variety of reasons. Because of the stigma and bias, most law enforcement officers and coroner officers have to be pushed to use the preferred names. Can you imagine? After all of the struggle one has to go through to come into one's own, to feel good about one's identity, and then to choose a name that fits, that someone would refuse to call you by that name? It happens all too frequently. It happens in families, and it happens in professional settings as well. And how many forms have you filled out for any sector that have asked you for your preferred pronouns or your preferred name? Or that you have an option on the form for trans instead of just male or female? Or to have an option to put other? Or to say, I don't wish to answer this question at all? I mention this because, just like I said last week, the violence of which we often see the end result begins with small things, and all the small things can ultimately lead to physical violence and murder. As we think about the Stonewall riots in New York City being the catalyst for the pride parades that now happen all over the world, it's important for us to focus our energy and attention on our trans siblings, and especially our trans Black women siblings, because they are not safe. We cannot be safe as community until everyone is safe. And we in this church can be a part of creating a world in which there is room enough for anyone who is trans, transgender, trans with an asterisk, gender fluid, gender nonconforming, and gender non-binary. Have you ever stopped to wonder why trans people are so unsafe? I have heard a myriad of stories from people who are at all different places on the gender spectrum, including transgender, trans with an asterisk, and all of them have stories that involve the aggression or violence of someone else towards them. Sometimes it's words, sometimes it's looks, sometimes it's behaviors like being followed by car or on foot. Sometimes it's gestures. Even the smallest of things feel terrifying because of the violence they experience on a regular basis. To understand the violence, we have to look at the deeper aspect of what is going on, and that begins with each one of us. How many trans people do you know personally? When you see a trans person or hear one, or you see someone who you think might be trans, what goes through your mind? What is your implicit bias when it comes to trans folks? What are the things you think that you would never tell another person? What are you curious about? What are you confused about? And a really important question, what are you afraid of? We can't be good advocates or activists or allies or accomplices for trans folks if we don't understand our own biases, assumptions, and certainly our own privileges. When we talk about white supremacy, we know that if we are white, we had better figure out our own racial prejudices so we can do the deep work we need to do to dismantle white supremacy and racist systems and structures. The same concept applies here. If we resist using pronouns that seem odd to us, like they, them, theirs, or if we see someone and feel upset that we don't know for sure what gender they were assigned at birth, if they're male or female, or if we think of trans people as dramatic or going through a stage, we clearly have a great deal of work to do. I'm always available to help you with this. Another great resource we have is Nick Carchidi. He has also offered to help us as a congregation move along in this and grow. Either one of us would be willing to help you work through this. What I've realized from the relationships I've had with various trans people is that I needed to work through my questions, my theology, my confusions, everything that might prevent me from being fully present with them. Though each one of them might have been willing to field my questions and curiosities, if I had asked, it would not have been life-giving for them. So I've had to do the reading and talking to people with more experience than I have and listening in to those who were willing to tell their stories, and I've needed to do that on my own. Over time, I've met many more people who identify as gender non-binary, gender non-conforming, gender fluid. I've heard from many people my age and older that there sure is a lot to keep up with. And I would say, yes, there is. And I feel it too. and the lives of those we love are at stake, so we need to keep up. One simple action we can each do is to take care with the use of pronouns. It's very important as we work to be welcoming and affirming of all trans people. Taking care around pronouns is important as we create a safe space and as we advocate for our trans siblings. Here are some important steps for all of us. When you meet someone for the first time, you can say, I use the pronouns she, her, or he, him, or they, them. What are your preferred pronouns? And then when they share that with you, try your darndest to use that pronoun with them. If someone shares a pronoun you're not familiar with, go with it and then find out later about it from someone who is not trans. An example might be the pronoun sie, zir. It's not one that most of us hear regularly or maybe have heard at all. We can do some research around it to find out where it came from. If you make a mistake and use the wrong pronoun, don't dwell on it or make a big deal of it. Simply acknowledge your mistake, correct it, and move on. When doing introductions in a group or a family event, model using pronouns by sharing yours and inviting everyone else to share their pronouns. When we were doing our church directory this year, we asked everyone to give their pronouns so we could print them. Some of you mentioned you didn't want your pronouns in it. I realize I should have done a much better job of explaining that it wasn't for your benefit to put them in the directory, but for the benefit of others who might not use the gendered pronouns that many of us are used to. If we're creating safe space, it's safest for us who are not at risk to use our pronouns in order to make a safe space so that someone can use their preferred pronouns. The same is true with our name tags. I might not feel the need to name my pronoun, but I will so that it can be safe for everyone. There's so much more to say and not enough time here, so we're going to offer a workshop this fall to continue our work on creating a safe and welcoming and affirming space for all trans people. I hope you loved the modern remix of 1 Corinthians 12 as much as I did. I'm so grateful to M. Barkley and the work they are doing with inflesh.com. When I think about our trans siblings, and especially our Black trans siblings, and Black trans women specifically, this passage comes to mind for me. What would the world look like, and how might life be different for trans folks if instead of feeling threatened by those who are different from us, we could believe deeply that the Spirit lives in them in ways that we need to see and know and hear and experience? What if we really believed that the Spirit gives all these different gifts so that we can each bring what we have to the work of the common good? Oh, wait a minute. The common good. That's our first mistake. We are so enculturated in white culture in this country, all of us, that we think it's about individualism and prosperity for me and mine. So if we're going to understand what the Spirit is up to, we have to first remember that we are not in this life for ourselves, but for the work of the common good. Work like a fair tax, work like protections for trans people in the workplace, in healthcare, in education, and even in death. Work like affordable housing, including for those no one wants living in their buildings. Work like gun violence prevention and making sure murderers are convicted for killing trans folks, including and especially if they are police officers. Work like investing in neighborhoods that have been looted throughout history by public policy and discriminatory housing and lending. Work like making sure trans people are counted in the census. Work like getting out the vote to oust an administration that has been terrible for our trans siblings. Friends, the work is hard, and we must persist so that we can bring the common good into fruition. And the gifts that come when trans folks are safe, alive, and able to thrive are innumerable. Amen.